Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's information session. Before we start, a reminder, this workshop is being live streamed. However, while this workshop is open to the public, it is for staff to provide guidance to elected members and is not a forum for debate or decisions. It is also not a forum for the public to provide input into decisions or bring other matters to the attention of council. If a member of the public does want to provide input, please talk to staff and they can help you have your say. Okay, we've had, no, we're pretty well right. I think, have we got some on Zoom? No, not yet. Okay, thank you. So we have here, welcome Bruce to talk to us about the implementation of the Greater Christchurch Partnership Joint Housing Action Plan Action 7. Good morning, Bruce.
Thank you. So Action 7 relates to expanding the operations of Otautahi Community Housing Trust, particularly into the Selwyn and Waimak area. So what we want to discuss today is make sure that you as councillors are aware of what we've been doing to implement that action, that you're aware of the preferred way forward, that you understand what the consequential impacts might be, and then you let us know, because we're following up with this with a formal report, any matters that you want to have further information so we can make sure we address that in that follow-up report. So the real background is there is interest from Selwyn and Waimak area district councils in having the OCHT operating in the area, developing and operating community housing. We also know there are other councils within the South Island who are interested in getting advice, not necessarily having operations or development occurring in the area, but at least getting advice from OCHT on their model because it's been a quite successful model to date. And in terms of that advisory function, we are interested in that because it does provide an additional potential revenue stream for OCHT. And also allows for retention of skills and experience, particularly in the development area, while there is some uncertainty about future government policy and the development pipeline that they have. So the Greater Christchurch Partnership Joint Housing Action Plan included that action to investigate the expansion of the model. We've looked into this quite closely, identified 5 different options, but we'll be recommending that we move forward with a private bill that amends the trust purpose. So the 5 options that we've looked at included taking the matter to the High Court, which is quite an expensive and time-consuming option and may not achieve success. We could ask a member of Parliament to submit a private member's bill. And the private member's bill is different from a private bill. That's a process where the bill is drawn out of effectively out of a hat, and so there's a degree of luck in there. We have looked at workarounds, setting up sister trusts that can operate in the area. Again, that's quite expensive. They'll need to have duplicate rules, duplicate governors, and different reporting arrangements. So it adds a lot of cost. And then with advice from the Minister's office, following a letter from the Mayor to the Minister, we've identified 2 other ones, a local bill or a private bill. And they're essentially variations on the same theme, where a bill is put up, it gets sponsored by a Member of Parliament, but it's not a matter of luck. It's a matter of negotiation through the clerk's office that it gets through. The local bill is where it relates specifically to a matter of interest to a council, and you need all councils affected to agree. A private bill is a matter that is more of interest to a private organisation or individual, and you don't need that degree of councillor or councils agreeing to it. So we're recommending the private bill, and the change that we're really asking for is to take away the restriction that's in the purpose of the current trust deed, which allows OCHT to only operate in Christchurch and Banks Peninsula. If we were to do this, we could introduce this year and we'd have expected time frame of 6 to 12 months. So what I'm interested in and would appreciate your views, and I'll go through all of these, and if you can give your views at the end, just the geographic scope. So we could limit it to just Selwyn and Waimak, which is the first one. We could say define it to the South Island area, or we could not have that defined and really focus that the purpose should be about providing community housing services, including advice, development and operation. The staff recommendation and the OCHT recommendation would be we don't define that purpose, so it's not restricted by a geographical area. So that allows both for the operation within Christchurch and potentially Selwyn and Waimak, and that advisory function more widely. And as an example, both council staff and OCHT previously had provided advice on a cohort basis in terms of OCHT to Wellington City Council for the setup of their trust. So that type of function could continue. The other aspects we've looked at is the impact on Christchurch City Council and both the service delivery and finances. And we don't believe that there will be any impact from this on our operations. And the reason for that is there's already separation of finances. So OCHT runs a portfolio that they own, and they have a separate set of books relate to that compared to the finances for the properties they lease for us. So they report on that separately to us, and then have the consolidated reports for themselves as an organisation. We have prudential limits and other controls that will remain. They are set in the security documents that we have, and they'll have to be honoured across the whole business. So they can't, OCHT won't be in a position to go out and borrow heavily in other areas and affect their own financial viability because they've got controls related to their existing security and borrowing from us. And there's an extensive performance monitoring process that's put in place in terms of our lease, and that won't be affected by the changes to the trust purpose. So those are protected. There are some consequential matters we will need to think about, and they're purely related to Christchurch City Council. The first of those is about the governance appointments. So at the moment, the board consists of 3 council-appointed trustees, and then there are 4 to 6 independent trustees that have an empathy with the people of Christchurch for whom the trust would provide social or affordable housing. So straight away, we'd need to change that so that it's not restricted to just the empathy for the people of Christchurch, and that would be a matter that can either be done through the bill or through normal changes to the trustee. What council might need to consider, and it's probably a matter for the appointments committee, is what should we do about our own appointees, whether that one you wish to expand that to include councillors from outside the Christchurch City Council area. The main concern and main matter that needs to be considered there will be that we cannot make OCHT have more council-appointed trustees than independents, because that would then turn it to a CCO, and that would then affect its ability to access government subsidies, the IRS, and remain as a Class 1 social housing landlord. The other matter that OCHT would like us to include, but we will be saying no to, is a mechanism whereby the council assets, the $45 million of land and buildings that we've transferred to them, whether the bill could allow for those to be returned to council directly, which they can't be at the moment because of the charitable status. We've had our legal advice has indicated that this is the wrong mechanism to do that. We should explore that through other mechanisms, and the lawyers providing advice in the private bill have actually provided us with a way forward for consideration, which we can handle separately, and we'll bring back to council for discussion. So that's just a matter really to bring to your attention that may be of concern to the OCHT Trust, but it doesn't need to be dealt through with this mechanism, and we can find another mechanism to have further discussions about. So our next steps will be to do a formal report to council to confirm that you're comfortable with this direction, and that will be coming with timeframes in September. So I'm going to stop there and, subject to the agreement of the chair, open up for questions and views.
Okay, first of all, we've got Pauline, then Sarah, then Jake.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Just looking at governance and, board members from outside of Otatahi, is that necessary? Because I see this as the Otatahi Housing Trust remaining as Otatahi Housing Trust, but with their reach being expanded. So what's wrong with keeping the board structure as it is?
Yep, there is no need to change. It's purely a matter of how you think that relationship might be, particularly if the trust is starting to operate, especially in Selwyn and Waimak. So that becomes already a question for governors to think about their relationship with governors in those council areas.
Yeah. So it might be better just to stay with the status quo in the short term and address that issue later on if you had to.
Yeah, and we don't need to address it through the bill.
No, and it's not something you have to address immediately, once the bill passes anyway, because it's not going to be a massive rush for untold social housing all over the show. It's going to be a walk gently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
But Bruce, we've got one trustee that goes out with rotation early next year, I believe.
One council appointee, yes. Former councillor Buck.
Yeah, that's right. So we could get a new trustee from, say, Waimak then, rather than have a big rush now, maybe. So the opportunity's there.
That will be a matter really for our appointments committee.
That's for them. Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine.
Well, no, it's a CCC appointment, so that fits under council's
of course, it's one of our
appointees to council organisations policy, and the council appointment committee makes that decision.
But bearing in mind that
or
still
recommendation.
the majority of the trust work is in Christchurch.
Yeah, but we aren't, correct me wrong, I'll say mine a little bit. I think this is very good because we've all been, and even when Yanni and I were on it, always been trying to expand just outside our boundary, so to speak, but the trust deed was so tight that we weren't allowed to step over the boundary, really. So this is good. Hang on, Yanni, I'll put your name down. But the OCHT model is extremely good, and even the minister is saying how good it is and how well we perform. So we're exemplar for the whole country, really, I see it. So it just gives us the ability to spread our wings over our neighbours and share the love with them. So I think this is really good that this is going forward. Sarah, please.
Thanks so much. Agree that we need to be going beyond our geographic boundaries. But what I was hearing you saying, I think, is that the recommendation would be to not limit it geographically, but to broaden it up. And I have some concerns in that space, and I'm just wondering if that would mean that over time, like with some of our other organisations, the focus ends up going on areas that might have a technically higher need and off Otatahi Christchurch. And so we would maybe lose the focus on increasing the community housing stock here at the expense of additional housing in areas elsewhere around the country. So my preference would be that we keep the geographic area for building new community homes to the neighbouring districts as well as us, but open it so that we are able to do that advice and guidance and those kind of things for the broader sector, if that makes sense. Is that possible?
Yep, we'll certainly explore that. Yes.
Yeah. I just do think that we should assess that risk of spreading too far and then the focus not being on here. We know that Kaingaora, for example, sees there's not as much need here as other places, so it's focusing elsewhere. And if OCHT was operating under a similar kind of mandate, go where the most need is, we might miss out.
Yep. So that's a very valid concern. We can provide advice on that. Just to, so it's Ministry of Housing and Urban Development rather than Kaingaora in terms
Yeah.
of that. And probably gives a chance to provide some of the latest that we're hearing from Wellington. So they are really focused on regional areas, particularly regional areas in the North Island,
Yeah.
but they are trying to find, they recognise there's still demand, particularly from Auckland and Christchurch, and they're looking into those areas more closely to see if there's other mechanisms
Okay.
there. So it's
Cool.
still on the government's radar, provision of additional social housing in Christchurch.
Cool, thanks.
Can I just add to that, Phil, that don't forget that, or remember that OCHT and the council, we are partners, and we have land, and the trust has an ability to, so I would envisage that the focus is still going to be really largely on Otatahi, but with the ability to stretch out. I don't know if it's a real threat, but it is worth
Yeah, but if other
exploring.
councils and I don't know, wherever in the North Island say, well, we've got a bit of land, will you come and do some building for us? I just think there's a risk that we get spread too thinly.
No, I couldn't
Yeah.
agree with you more, because we do very well because we're a tight, close-knit unit. If we start thinking we're going to take over the South Island, we see it spread so thin, you end up with issues. So stick to what we do best. Okay, Jake, please.
Yeah, kind of similar to what Sarah was saying. When I initially first heard of this proposal, I thought, that would clearly be a terrible idea, because we would be splitting and not focusing on what we're here to do, which is look after people of Christchurch. But can you explain a little bit about how those HUD contracts work? Because where I am now is more in the space that actually there's capacity to develop, that the Housing Trust simply would be sitting on their hands, if not, but to expand into Waimak and Selwyn.
And so you said HUD contracts? Yeah. So the contracts you're talking about there are the capacity contracts, which allow for building of new social housing. They're generally 25-year contracts that the provider has to make the housing available for 25 years for that purpose. They ensure that the tenants pay an income-related rent. So an income-related rent is generally 25% of a tenant's income. There's a subsidy that tops it up to 100% of the market rent that goes to the provider, and plus a supplement over the top to assist. And those contracts effectively mean that properties are paid off in that time, and there's a small surplus, and all their operating costs, interest costs, etc., are covered in that period.
I think what I was asking is it true that we take every opportunity to build, to grab a HUD contract and build a house whenever they're offered in Christchurch?
If we can, absolutely.
But there are opportunities to do more with outside. Yeah.
And that means sometimes we need to pivot slightly. So at the moment, we know that there is a really large demand for one-bedroom units. The government's priorities at the moment are getting families out of motels. So we're looking at making sure we're building some family units so we can provide that opportunity and help achieve those objectives.
Okay, Tim, please.
Yeah, just I have real concerns about this, and the OCHT model is excellent. There's no question. You could argue that it's probably the best that's ever been in New Zealand. But to date, who's paying for the costs? You mentioned before about lawyers looking at the options, etc. Who's paying for that?
To date, council has met those costs for the options, a relatively small amount.
But if you look at this room, we've got all the staff, etc. So an hourly rate. The ratepayers of Christchurch are paying for this. So I'm just wondering, why can't we do what EY and KPMG and all those guys do and clip the ticket with government contracts, etc.? Why don't we do that with Selwyn and Waimak? We're not after profit, we're after social value. But why do we need to expand something that doesn't need expanding?
Yeah. So I suppose, can I answer that in two ways? First of all, why we're taking the lead. We're taking the lead because we've got the most to lose out of this, and we want to make sure we don't lose from it. So that's why we're trying to hold the pen and make sure that Christchurch's interests are protected. In terms of whether there's potential for others to help pay for that, that's something we can explore through the Greater Christchurch Partnership and see whether there's mechanisms to get some of those additional, recover some of those costs and for them to contribute to that as a whole. So certainly happy to take that on board and raise that with the Greater Christchurch Partnership.
What do you mean by most to lose?
Because we are the ones who have the relationship already. We have the lease for our 1,900 odd units. So we want to make sure that any changes don't affect what we're already doing and deliver from it.
But we're kind of most to lose. We're actually creating the risk ourselves, aren't we?
We're managing the risk.
But if we concentrated on Christchurch, which remember the ratepayers of Christchurch have paid for everything as to date. So this is for, and it was totally centric focused on Christchurch and Banks Peninsula. The models of success, there's no question about that. Waimak and Selwyn, and you could look at everywhere else, unable to or haven't invested in their social housing to date, which is their choice. So I guess my concern is, A, we lose focus in Christchurch, because there must be a loss of focus at somewhere, because we're going to have to focus in other areas. But the ratepayers of Christchurch have paid for everything to date. And I'm just wondering why we can't use our staff's knowledge and OCHT's success to advise and as consultants to Waimak and Selwyn, rather than actually risking our own assets, which the ratepayers of Christchurch have paid for.
Yeah. So we can certainly present that as an option through the main report when it comes through. That we just do that on a consultancy basis, but don't look to change the trust deed. So that's an option.
Yep.
But I would just say that we don't believe there is any risk to our assets through this.
That's not really, it's, and I mean, if you're looking at a local bill or a private bill, both the MPs for Selwyn and Waimak would jump at this with a bloody heartbeat, let's be honest, So that's, I don't think that's going to be an issue.
Yeah.
Just throw my old OCHT 5 bobs worth in. One of the things I used to hear when I was around there, that before OCHT was born, we, council, when we were running it, we weren't doing a particularly good job. We weren't making money. Things weren't flash.
So when we operated it, we weren't eligible for government subsidies.
Correct.
When OCHT took it over, they were eligible for government subsidies. So there was a significant additional amount of revenue that came in, which then allowed us to start to catch up on things like deferred maintenance and so on. Don't have that percentage off the top of my head, but it's quite a significant percentage increase.
And very roughly, OCH2 they own and owe us money on half of them. Numbers not half, and council still owns half, which OCHT manages and gives a return to council for that it never had before.
Yeah. So the original split was around 50 million. We capitalised them, which is a mixture of land, buildings, and a little bit of cash. We retained about 300 million worth of value, and that broadly works out to around 500 units went to them, and we kept 1,900 units.
And the other thing that I used to hear at OCHT, that out in, say, Selwyn or Waimak, and I don't believe that we should be hanging on to it ourselves, sorry, Tim, and they start up another raft of trustees and God knows what, or when our system works particularly well. One of the things, a little bit in Waimak and a little bit in Selwyn, they've got the land, but they haven't got anywhere near as many social houses, and social housing tenants come back into Christchurch sometimes and use, I shouldn't say use ours, but they come here because they haven't got enough out there. So if we can help them build and use their land out there with HUD money and get more done, it takes the pressure off us with things coming back. So,
with all due respect, the discussion isn't about how well OCHT works, because that's already been established and agreed. But everyone in Selwyn and Waimak come to Christchurch, whether they're working or using our facilities, they obviously don't want to pay for them. So that's already established, and we already know that. What the question is how best we can support social housing being established and growing in Selwyn and Waimea. And I don't believe personally that it should be at the expense of our ratepayers. That's all I'm saying.
Yep. Yanni, then Mark, then Mel.
Yeah, I'm glad the Mayor mentioned about OCHT. I guess I'm a little bit frustrated because, I mean, this is basically the advice I gave to OCHT 2 years ago. So I don't, and you'll recall at the board meetings, this was the obvious approach 2 years ago. Didn't need legal, I mean, in my view, didn't need a complicated legal thing, but we had extensive legal advice to the trust. I can't understand why this has taken so long to get to this point.
I can't comment. You're talking about something that wasn't involved in.
Because my simplistic way of looking at it was, right, we've got a trust that isn't working. Let's wind it up and 30 seconds after it, start a new one. That's a simplistic way of looking at it. It wasn't good. So that's what has to do that.
In the meantime, we've signed up to this joint housing action plan. Do we have any sense of, I mean, I'm aware that, like, not this LTP, but the one 3 years ago, the different councils were supposed to make budget provision to deal with social and affordable housing. Have they done that? Are we aware of what the contributions that the other councils have put in place towards social and affordable housing?
It's not something I have off the top of my head. I can ask those councils through the JHAP, the Joint Housing Action Plan group, working group.
Yeah, I mean, I just pick up on Tim's point. I think we do need to make sure that we are getting a fair allocation of resources from those councils as part of the Urban Growth Partnership, because it does seem inherently unfair that we pay for the entire cost and then they just come and piggy tail after doing nothing for 6 years.
Yeah,
right?
It is actually.
The only other question I had was just one point that Tim made was that this was all paid for by ratepayers. Actually, central government gave a lot of housing contracts to OCHT, which is why they're able to build new ones. So it's not all, there is a lot of central government money that's gone in. I mean, obviously setting it up, we also had some money from the housing accord.
Yeah.
I think that came from government as well. But I was just interested because with what the government are doing, do we have any sense around what they're doing around housing? Because the other thing that seemed to be really obvious is that OCHT maintenance was a lot more cost effective than both Kāinga Ora and us doing it ourselves. And I wondered if there'd been any discussion with government around looking at what's happening with Kāinga Ora, because my sense is they're removing, you know, if we're going to make changes to the trust deed, is there an ability for us to have an ability for us to actually look at the trust taking on more maintenance across housing? I mean, I don't quite understand how specific the trust deed is in that space.
So we're really starting to get outside of the scope of today, but I think that there are some matters, particularly around government policy, that it's worthwhile doing some further work on and getting that through to councillors. Timing of that, we know that out of the Kāinga Ora review, there was indication from the final report, or the final government response. They expected a second stage of response to occur around August. So timing of when we can get you some further information would be once that information has gone to Cabinet and then has been released publicly, because that's going to start to talk about, they have talked about community housing associations, 4 community housing associations coming out of Kāinga Ora. We don't know what that would look like. Would be good to have an understanding of that, because that could align with what you're talking about.
Yeah, it seems to me a big risk is City Care, the Spencer Henshaw contract getting less and less and less in value.
Yeah, that's right. But this is about spreading our wings, being able to spread our wings. So that sort of stuff will happen as time goes by if we decide to spread our wings. So we just got to spread the love out into our neighbours.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I guess the only other concern I would have is that in terms of the trust deed, just what happens with the assets and how we deal. I wasn't quite sure why they wanted to give us back the 45 million.
So at the moment, the 45 million sits as a loan from council to the trust. On our books, it's written down because the expectation is it would normally not be returned, only in the event that the OCHT became insolvent. So it's written down, but it sits on their books at value, and that means it affects their prudential ratios and their ability to borrow for further developments. So they've got a constant interest in finding a way to remove that liability from their books. So that's why they're interested in it. We have a less of a focus on that.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Mark, please.
Yeah, thank you. Exciting, I think, to be able to consider spreading the wings. I know I tend to agree with Sarah on this, that spreading geographically to our neighbours at first is wise, not trying to run before we can walk, and then acting as an advisor elsewhere, beyond that, I think is wise as well, so we can share the love and share the model. So, yeah, nice work.
Thank you, Mark. Listening intently. Melanie, please.
So what's the advantage to Christchurch for this if this was to go ahead and be expanded?
I suspect that the primary advantages relate to our relationship with our neighbours.
Right, okay. And is there an opinion from the board of OCHT around this?
When I met with them last week, they were supportive of the direction.
Okay. And with, because the tenants get support, right? So what covers the cost of that? How's that covered?
How do you mean?
Well, there's people that are employed, right, who help tenants, when they need it. What covers that cost?
Yeah. So under the current arrangements, there is rent collected from tenants, and then there is subsidy that comes from the government. That then is effectively a portion is taken out for operation of OCHT, a proportion is taken out for maintenance, and a proportion is taken out for capital, and the residual comes to us. Right. So it's effectively the services is through the rent and the government subsidies. This is a rates neutral service, so there are no rates go from council back into this. In fact, we pay rates, and that's one of the big, with insurance, one of the big costs that affect our portfolio.
So any developments that would be done outside of Christchurch would attract the same subsidy, and the model would be the same and costs would be the same. Was that right? What I'm wondering is, could there be any decrease in support for tenants if we were to expand, I guess?
So for our tenants, no, because the controls sit outside of the trust deed. The controls on that and our expectations are sitting in our lease through with OCHT. If there is development in, say, Waimak or Selwyn, it could be under that HUD model that I described before for Councillor McClellan. And in that case, all those costs would be met through rents and subsidies. It's possible because those contracts are getting harder to get, that there may be developments that are on a more subsidised rental basis, similar to what we used to do. We would need to be working closely to make sure that there was no impacts on sustainability of OCHT on that if they went down that path. That's a matter that we're going to have to consider for ourselves anyway, because we may wish to do further developments that aren't attracting the government subsidies. So we need to do some more work on that and bring that forward to council for consideration.
Okay, so will all that be written up in the report when this comes to us, so that we have...
The key parts will be, some of this is looking at really strategic future direction, and we've already signalled, and I'm about to have a discussion with Councillor Cotter about this, with the board of the trust. The final of the original board members resign next year because they have a 9-year limited tenure. So it's probably timely to, when that renewal of the board is complete, that there is a governance to governance discussion to make sure that future strategies are aligned. So I'm starting to have some discussions with Councillor Cotter about arranging that, and that can be some of the work that would fall out of that work to come and talk to you about future strategies.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
Good questions, good answers. We've got Tyler, and then we'll wrap it up, and because that gives you direction on where we're thinking. Thank you, Tyler.
Kia ora, Bruce. I'll make it quick. I'm really supportive of the joint housing action plan because it is joint. There's a lot of political benefits, and actually, most importantly, there's a lot of benefits for people who need the homes, regardless of whether they're in Waimak or so on. So I'm continuing to keep going with this. The only stick I have is hoping that we're able to have BAU within Christchurch. We don't go down on our deliverables in terms of the way that we deliver housing and be able to maintain our homes in lieu of our partners. But that's pretty much me. I'm really supportive of it. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for good questions, and thank you, Bruce. Good on you. Okay, so now we have Alan and Shana, who will talk to us about the Gambling and TAB Venues Policy Review 2024. And then okay, far away.
The slides aren't set up on the screen.
They're causing me a lot of troubles.
Oh, there we go. Kia ora koutou. In March, we briefed councillors on the review of the council's gambling and TAB venues policy. And at that information section, you requested for us to come back to kind of clarify council's role in gambling. And we also thought it'd be a good idea to run through some policy options with councillors. So today we'll start with an overview of the council's role, share the results of our review before running through policy options to facilitate councillor discussion. So the role of the council in gambling is relatively limited. So for Class 4 gambling, an applicant for a new venue must first get council consent, considering using our gambling venue policy. So we must have a policy where we specify whether and where new venues can establish, and the policy may also specify restrictions on number of machines and include a relocation policy. For TABs, our role is also limited. Council consent is just required if TAB New Zealand proposes to establish a new venue. So again, we must have a policy. This is quite limited. It only applies to TAB stores and standalone TAB. And our policy must specify whether and where new venues can be established. So what's out of scope? So there's a lot of gambling issues that the council doesn't have a role in. We only, again, can decide whether to grant new consents for Class 4 or TAB venues. The Department of Internal Affairs is the primary regulator of gambling in New Zealand. It undertakes gambling licensing, compliance and enforcement functions. The Ministry of Health coordinates and funds problem gambling services, provides information on gambling harm and develops strategic plans focused on preventing and minimising gambling harm in New Zealand. At the last information session, some councillors raised some concerns around online gambling. This feedback was reiterated by many gambling stakeholders. This is an emerging space. Except for TAB New Zealand and the Lotteries Commission, online gambling is not legal in New Zealand. Therefore, any other online gambling is through an overseas-based provider and not regulated in New Zealand. The Ministry of Health's latest strategy to prevent and minimise gambling harm reflects concerns relating to growing opportunities to gamble online, including those offered by overseas-based gambling operators. DIA is currently undertaking a review into online gambling in New Zealand. The outcome of this review is still to be released, although we do note this morning the Minister announced an approach to regulate online casinos, which will start in 2026. A key point for this is that it is not the role of the council to make land-based gambling more readily available as an alternative to online gambling. The research we have done also indicates the differences in the groups playing pokies at venues versus those online. So then what's in scope? So there's 4 key issues the council needs to consider. which are new Class 4 venues and machines, relocation of existing Class 4 venues, mergers of existing Class 4 clubs, and new TAB venues. So our current policy, we have a combined Class 4 and TAB venues policy, which is common amongst local authorities. Our policy settings have been in place since 2004. Our policy is based on a sinking lid approach for pokie venues, meaning the council will not grant consent for new venues or agree to increase the number of machines at existing venues. The policy allows for clubs with poker machines to merge, and they can have up to 18 machines. We do not have a policy on relocations, and the effect of this is that we cannot allow Class 4 venues to relocate. We allow TAB venues to establish subject to statutory and district plan requirements. While standalone TAB venues are within the scope of this policy, the existence in our district is quite rare. We only have 3. The purpose of the policy is to control the growth of gambling, prevent and minimise gambling harm, and facilitate community involvement in decisions about the provision of gambling. So earlier in the year, following meeting with councillors, we engaged with stakeholders on our current policy. So this was with corporate societies who have venue licenses in our district and problem gambling health providers. Corporate societies generally oppose the current policy as they prefer to cap with a relocation provision. The specifics around the kind of relocation provisions varied. They also noted the inconsistency between our TAB and pokey approaches. So as I said, sinking lid for pokies and having limited, not many restrictions on TABs. Problem gambling organisations generally supported the current policy, but suggested some ways to strengthen the policy. So these included being explicit in the policy on not allowing relocations, not allowing mergers, and having sinking lids on TABs. And I'll hand over to Alan.
So in terms of the findings of the review, machine and venue numbers are continuing to decline in Christchurch. In March of 2004, when the policy was first adopted, we had 2,158 machines and 164 venues. And as at March of this year, we have 1,240 machines and 76 venues. So a reduction of over 900 machines in the last 20 years. And just to note, there have been some fluctuation in venue and machine numbers over the years. This is not council granting consent. So this is 2 things. Venues don't always operate the maximum number of machines their licence permits. And then sometimes venues can apply to have their licence put on hold by the DIA if they are undergoing refurbishments or for whatever reason the business is not operating for a period of time. And that is at the sole discretion of the DIA. So this graph shows the expenditure by quarter for Christchurch. Expenditure is also referred to as gaming machine profit and refers to the money put into machines versus less money paid out in prizes. So it's money lost by gamblers. There have been seasonal fluctuations and then the COVID dip of 2020, but expenditure remains relatively stable and is proportionately aligned with national trends. The total expenditure in Christchurch in 2023 was $93.4 million. There is also an element of inflation at play, particularly in the last couple of years. But even when these figures are adjusted for CPI, there does not appear to be a clear link between the number of machines and expenditure in Christchurch. So in terms of how Christchurch compares to other major New Zealand cities and to national averages, the graph on the left shows gaming machines on a per capita basis. Christchurch has 3.1 gaming machines per 1,000 residents. This is higher than the national average of 2.7 and higher than any major New Zealand city. The graph on the right shows Class 4 expenditure on a per capita basis. In 2023, Class 4 gambling expenditure per capita in Christchurch was $234, which was the second highest of all the major cities behind Tauranga and higher than the national average of $199. So this graph shows the distribution of venues by socioeconomic deprivation. In March of 2015, we had 90 Class 4 gambling venues. 45 of those were located in medium, high and high deprivation communities, so 50% of all venues. And as at March of this year, of our 76 venues, 34 are located in medium, high and high deprivation communities, which is 44% of all venues. So this is trending downwards even without a relocation policy. And what we see here is that Class 4 gambling venues are disproportionately located in areas of high socioeconomic deprivation, and this is reflected nationally as well. The national average is 60% of all venues, so on this metric we are doing better than the national average. And this mapping just shows the spatial distribution of the gaming machines in Christchurch with the area unit deprivation. We do also have some data on how expenditure changes across the deprivation scores. This data was provided to us raw by DAA on the basis that it is not published in a way that identifies any venues. So we've presented this as average expenditure per venue across the deprivation scores. The key point here is there is not a linear trend line for expenditure. The data does not seem to indicate that moving venues into low deprivation communities would necessarily reduce expenditure. It would likely just move the harm into another community. And to note, we do believe deprivation 3 may be a bit of an outlier due to the number of machines several venues were operating in 2023. So in terms of people who are seeking assistance for problem gambling, in July 2022 and June of 2023, we had 508 clients in Christchurch assisted, with 253 of them never having accessed intervention services before. This accounts for 11.5% of all clients nationally, so we are overrepresented here, given that we're just under 8% of the population. Generally, over the last 10 years, client numbers have reflected national trends as well. Despite some annual variability, overall problem gambling intervention service client numbers in Christchurch are gradually declining. And in terms of what people are reporting as their primary mode of gambling, Class 4 gambling is the most common at 49%, and this has been the case for a long time and reflects national trends as well. And in terms of TAB, 10% of clients reported this was their primary mode of gambling. So there is harm associated with TAB betting, but not to the same extent as other forms of gambling. And we know this includes all kinds of TAB, not just standalone TAB venues. So you've been provided with a social impact assessment as part of the briefing material for today. But just to recap on the findings, so Class 4 gaming venue and machine numbers are declining. We have more pokie machines per venue and more machines per head of population than the national average. Class 4 expenditure remains relatively steady. Location of venues does not seem to be indicative of expenditure, and we have higher per capita rates of people seeking assistance for problem gambling compared to the national average. And under legislation, 40% of all gambling expenditure is required to be returned to the community by way of grants. In 2023, a little over 29 million was returned to the Christchurch community, and a big recipient of this funding is sports groups at $16.7 million. But in 2023, expenditure in Christchurch was 93.4 million, and 40% of this is 37.4 million. So there is some loss of funding to other regions. Some of this is likely to be national groups, of which the Christchurch community could see some benefit. So we just note the data does have some limitations, particularly in acknowledging where benefit may be received. And a report commissioned by the DAA highlighted this evidence strongly suggests that Class 4 gambling grant funding amplifies disadvantage by transferring wealth from more deprived communities to less deprived communities. So in terms of policy options, just a reminder, our current policy settings are a sinking lid on Class 4 gambling venues and machines. We do not have a policy on relocations. We allow clubs to merge and we restrict the machine numbers at the merged venue, and we allow TAB venues to establish. So the first question of will the council grant consent for new Class 4 venues in the district is really the crux of the council's policy. We currently have a sinking lid, so we're at option A, and this is the strictest policy setting available to us. The purpose of this is that as a venue closes, it is not replaced, which reduces opportunities to gamble and may reduce harm from problem gambling. And if you are looking to soften the policy settings, option B is a cap. So you could set a cap on venue and machine numbers. And if there was room within the cap, new venues could establish. If the cap was set, you could set the cap a little bit lower than current numbers, in which case there would be effectively a sinking lid until that point is reached. And then a little bit higher would potentially increase gambling availability. And then another option is a permissive policy, which is option C. So the only restrictions would be those imposed by the Act. This would likely see an increase in gambling availability, and it is not recommended. So the rationale for the current policy is that Christchurch has more gambling machines per capita than any other major New Zealand city, and the primary intent of the policy is to reduce accessibility in order to minimise harm. Machine numbers are declining, although this is happening slowly, so the policy is doing what it is supposed to do. We have limited literature in this space, but what we do have indicates that a sinking lid is the best option to limit gambling expenditure, and then the second best option would be a cap. So the second question for the council to consider is whether existing venues could relocate and take their machines with them. We currently do not have a policy on venue relocation, so we're currently at option B. The effect of this is that we cannot grant consent for venues to relocate. Advice in the past had been that there was still an avenue for venues to relocate via the DAA, although this is no longer available. We could add a provision that the council will not allow venues to relocate. This would provide clarity for venues and for the public. However, it would be largely symbolic. The effect of the current policy is that no relocations are allowed. And then an alternative would be allowing venues to relocate, so moving to option C. This could potentially help to address the higher risk of gambling related harm in high socioeconomic areas, deprivation areas, sorry. But venue numbers are declining in these areas anyway. We have no way to force venues to relocate. This would just provide an avenue for venues to do so. It would likely work against the intent of the sinking lid. A venue that otherwise could have closed could remain open. And this again could just shift the problem into another community. If the council wanted to consider this further, we would recommend restrictions around the location of relocated venues. So a more minor issue the council can consider is whether Class 4 clubs can merge, and if so, how many machines they can have. The legislation currently allows up to 30 with ministerial approval. Currently, we allow club mergers and they can have 18 machines, so we're at option C. We can't find any record of clubs having merged since the policy was adopted though. Currently, there are 7 clubs in the district. 6 are licensed to have 18 machines. So even if 2 merged, it would result in 1 venue closing and between 12 and 18 machines being taken out of circulation. But our policy is considered one of the softer options by the problem gambling sector. Another option is option B, which would be to retain club mergers but further limit the number of machines at a merged venue. But again, we have no record of clubs having merged in the past. And then if council was looking to strengthen the policy, you could move to option A, which is to have no club mergers. So you would essentially have a sinking lid, a blanket sinking lid with no exceptions. Again, the impact of this is likely to be minimal. And then if you wanted to further lessen the restrictions on this policy, you can move to option D, which is to allow club mergers with no machine restrictions, other than those set by the Act and the Minister, or you could pick a number that's greater than 18 but fewer than 30. But to go back to the intent of the policy, reducing problem gambling harm by reducing accessibility, this option could likely increase the number of machines in any community because all the current clubs are in different parts of the city. And then the final question is whether TAB venues are allowed to establish in the district. We currently allow TAB venues to establish, so we're at option C, but there has not been an increase in venue numbers in the last 20 years. Since the policy was first adopted, we've gone from 10 venues to 3. We have granted consent for TAB venues in the past though. And if you were looking to strengthen the policy settings a little bit, you could move to option B, which is to put a cap on venue numbers. Would likely have little impact. Standalone is not a preferred outlet for TAB. They're focused on pub and kiosk TABs and in particular the online space. Policy change is unlikely to have any impact on standalone. And then the strictest policy setting is option A, which is a sinking lid on TAB venues. potentially could help reduce the impact of problem gambling associated with TAB services, but again has no impact on the establishment of other TAB in the district. It would, however, bring the TAB policy into line with Class 4 venues if you kept the sinking lid. And as just mentioned, if council is to proceed with an option to allow for new or relocated venues, we would recommend including restrictions around where the new venues can go. And this could be in conjunction with the social impact assessment completed at the time of application. So one way you could do this is to set restrictions on the proximity to sensitive sites, including early childhood education centres, schools, places of worship, marae, and other community facilities. You could also set limit on the geographical concentration of venues and machine numbers. So you could say venues cannot be within 200 metres of each other. Another restriction is you could put limits of machine and venue numbers by area or ward. And then you could also restrict venue locations based on deprivation. So no venues may relocate or establish in areas with medium, high or high deprivation scores. There are significant associations between distance to the nearest gambling venue and gambling behaviour. A lot of the data talks about proximity in kilometres, neighbourhood or area more generally. So these settings would help to limit harm, but we think potentially not in significant ways. So this policy has remained unchanged since it was first adopted in 2004. The age of the policy means it could really do with a tidy up to reflect new legislation and terminology, but it can't be done without a special consultative procedure. The policy would also benefit from a general tidy up to enhance the readability of the policy and include things like a definition section. We note the council last formally sought the views of this policy in 2006. Reviews since then have primarily sought the views of stakeholders only. The legislation that enabled councils to consider relocation policies wasn't enacted until 2013, so we've never consulted the community on this. The time since the last SCP has been a source of criticism in past reviews. So while the policy settings are relatively appropriate and the ways in which the policy could be strengthened are minor, we think it is a good opportunity to refresh the drafting of the policy and to reconfirm community views on our policy settings. So the next steps will depend on what council wants to do. A rollover of the policy would not require further consultation, but any option that proposes changes to the policy, even drafting changes, will require an SCP. If the recommendation is that the policy is rolled over for a further 3 years, we'll bring up a report to council for adoption. And if the recommendation is that we make changes to the policy, a report will go to council to agree to go out for consultation on the revised policy. Consultation on any changes must be undertaken in accordance with the SCP requirements of the LGA. And then following a hearings panel, a report will be presented to the council for adoption. At this stage, we are after some direction from council on what you would like us to do and what kind of report you would like us to bring you in September.
Ooh, you haven't been sitting around doing nothing for the last couple of months, have you? Okay, got a number of questions. Thank you. Jake, please, then Pauline.
Highest, did you say highest machine use, highest machine numbers per anywhere in the country? How did that situation occur?
So our machines, the machines that we have are what we've had since 2004 when we first adopted a sinking lid.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know why we continue to have such high per capita numbers, given our sinking lid has been in place for so long. So it's not really clear why those numbers are stubbornly high, and that trend has been like that for a very long time.
Because initially when I was looking at it and it said that our machines were also the most profitable anywhere in the country, I thought that'll be because we have the lowest per capita, but then that's not the case. So why are they then the most profitable if they're also the most numerous? Do you know? I know it's maybe...
I'm not sure why. Yeah, I'm not sure why our per capita spend is so high either. We technically have the strongest policy settings available, but
and for a long time,
our role in gambling is very limited, and so problem gambling is a much bigger issue than just what our council can control. And a lot of this responsibility is sits for central government.
Right.
So.
And maybe just that we're very enthusiastic about pokies. Thank you.
Okay, Pauline.
Thank you. I was wondering if it was because we once had a lot of working men's clubs, didn't we, with big booze barns, you know, like Green Road and Mackenzie's and all that, with lots of pokies. And so I don't know. Do we have any evidence to tell us what the risk is that if people cannot access a gambling machine or a TAB, that they then move online? Because that could be seen as a bit of a risk.
We don't know enough about how people are using online gambling, and we only have anecdotal information from the problem gambling sector. And what they've told us is that there seems to be different sets of people who are using online gambling services versus those who are playing pokies on in land-based venues. So there doesn't seem to be a crossover, but we are still waiting on further information from DIA. But with respect to TAB, it does seem that they are intentionally moving people into more online spaces.
Yes, and I think with people becoming more digitally literate, if you like, that may increase. And because there's not so much visibility then with online, and nor is there as much that goes back into the community. Is that correct?
So the online games, no, because they are overseas based providers. So the Minister for Internal Affairs announced this morning that there would be some licenses issued for online casino from 2026. We haven't seen any of that legislation yet. The announcement just came out this morning, and that will return some funds to the community and by way of taxes as well. But that's a different issue to this policy.
Right. And so you've also said that the number of machines in high deprivation areas is actually declining anyway, naturally, and a number of pokies is also declining naturally. So our sinking lid is working. So my kind of question is, do we need to do this now? Because the council, and we've just done our LTP, we're squeezed as heck. Or could it wait till next year or the year after, in your view?
So you could just roll it over if that is something that you wanted to do. This is your decision. We do have to review it every 3 years, but the review is complete. So we could just bring a report to council in September to roll it over, and then we'll come back to you in 3 years.
Well, we wouldn't have to roll it over for 3 years, would we?
This.
We could look at it again after we've gone over the bump, in 2 years maybe. Is that correct?
Yeah, we can review it earlier. If you wanted to get it out of the LTP cycle, we could bring it back in 2026 or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's some things in there that need to be fixed up, and there's a couple of things that could be tweaked, and there's opportunity. But my question to you was, do you consider this urgent that needs to be done?
No, it's not urgent. They are just minor
okay. Thanks.
Changes that would be made. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Aaron, please.
Yeah, only worth doing if we're going to do something different. If we're not doing anything different, then don't do it. Would be so a couple of bigger questions whether we can do is, how long do the current trusts rule over all of those machines? So is that just indefinite?
Yes. So we only have a role when they request a new license, and then any ongoing compliance and regulatory work sits with the DIA. But once they've got those machines and the license to have those machines, as long as that license doesn't expire, they've got the machine.
It's just forever.
Yep.
Okay. So then, do we ever have the power to say and pick a number, 10 years time, that all of them expire and the council will take them over and will become like it?
No. Unless we had central government direction to do so, we can't do that.
Okay, as that rules out that one. Then can we also, in the next big one, form our own trust, and then any new licenses become owned by the council and the community, and the money gets distributed through Strengthening Communities Fund?
So
No,
So we don't have, so are you talking about like with the Invercargill licensing trust, how they have?
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
like other councils have, just for Jake. He's from Invercargill and doesn't remember.
Okay, thank you very much for this enlightening question.
So can we do it?
So to have a license to have venues, you would, or machines, you would need to have a non-sinking lid to then create that kind of entity. I don't think that would be within the scope of this policy. That would be a completely different question for council to consider.
So we can or can't.
That would be a question for legal. Sorry, I don't know.
Can we find that out? Because we've got some sitters of venues. Like I think the departure lounge at the airport would be a great one. Over at where the wharf is for all the cruise ships, for the third of the people on the cruise ship that don't get off, if they can walk straight down to the wharf and engage in some light entertainment, where all the money comes back to the economy, our economy, and then our new stadium would be a sitter for a lounge.
Yes. Tyler, please.
Kia ora. Thanks for doing all this. This is amazing work. I'm just going to cut to the chase. I've been in this space for quite some time with the communities, and the real question is, in your work that you've done from back then to now, can you answer the simple question of why do you think our communities are gambling? Just to get to the core issue of this policy.
That's and why problem gambling rates are so high, I'm not sure. So we know that people gamble for addiction reasons and for other reasons. They like the social environment that a pokey venue gives them, particularly sort of older people. But yeah, it's an addiction issue.
Cool.
That is, yeah.
So the page, referring to page 15 of the presentation, which is the deprivation statistics through location, I'm not surprised by it at all. And the reason why I'm not surprised by it is because the serious gamblers who actually contribute to a lot to the community funds are actually called jackpot hunters. So what they do is they have a circuit of pokie machines that provide jackpots of $900 or more, and therefore they're addressing it. And usually the jackpots are in the more lower deprived area. Actually, the irony is a lot of it is in Pauline's ward. So they do a big circuit, and so that's why this statistic actually doesn't surprise me. The question I've got is around caps on jackpots, because the reason why they go in is high risk, high reward. What if we made it high risk, low reward? And I'm under the understanding that the DIA set the caps.
Yeah, that's
for jackpots. Is that
that's
correct?
not us. We don't have any role there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, I think the way to stop them or slow pokie machine users down would be to make the reward less. And I'm wondering if there may be a way we might be able to request the DIA to do that at some point, not now. But I'm in agreement with the rest of the policy too. I think that's fantastic. And this is just some feedback. And also we don't get to manage the timing of the jackpot, right? So the way that the jackpot accumulates, that's
So
DIA also.
we don't really have any role in how the machines function, and like we simply regulate consents, but in terms of how they work and that whole losses disguised as wins and that kind of thing, we don't have a role in it. It definitely would be central government. So
Okay.
We can certainly keep an eye out for consultations from the DIA and look for opportunities to advocate for stronger settings that help to minimise harm in our communities. But yeah, that role sits with DIA.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much.
Okay, Timothy, then Andre.
Yeah, look, I'd be supporting the status quo at the moment, because I think that what we don't really understand and comprehend is the amount of money going into the online gambling. And when you see people in their 30s in Australia and elsewhere suddenly billionaires, you can imagine how much money is going through without coming back to a community. So at least there's some money going back to communities. It's not a positive thing in the overall. And like you say, the hunting, the jackpots, etc. I think what would be the most productive for us as a community is for us to somehow kind of meet with DIA and raise our concerns and maybe look at some suggestions about trying to spread the harm and lowering it, because I just think that what's happening with the online gambling is just out of control. And yeah, I kind of know a couple of guys that are involved in it, and it's just growing, and that's really the issue. Thank you.
Okie dokie. Andre?
Thank you. Obviously, doing this would require a lot of resource. What are the types of things that resource could be used for instead? Are there other policies that are also sort of due for reviewing? What would this be taking away from?
If we weren't doing this, maybe my team leader could speak to this.
So it will enable us to bring forward other policy reviews on our work program. Alan is scheduled to get stuck into the significance and engagement policy review next. So that would be one, and we have a range of other policies, requests for review on our waiting list that we could bring forward.
It's quite busy.
Yeah, yep. There are always alternatives to any individual policy review.
Cool. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yep, Sarah, please.
Thanks so much. I was on the last hearings panel last time we did this. I can't recall if we made any. I don't think we made any changes. I think they just sort of carried right through last time.
Yeah, we've never made changes to this policy since it was first adopted.
Yeah, and we did look at the relocation policy and those kind of things last time, and we decided it was best not to make the changes. Yes, there was a couple of submissions saying allow us to.
Yeah, it's been looked at as part of past reviews. Okay. Since the Act was amended.
So yeah, I mean, my opinion is let's just get a report saying let's roll it over. But I think at the same time we should maybe have a recommendation resolution in there that does ask us, that does get for the council to write to the relevant minister asking for some legislative change on the total jackpot pool and those kind of things to help reduce harm. So if we had that as part of it, work out what things we could ask for that would reduce harm and make that part of just the resolutions, I think that would be really useful. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Kelly, please.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating report. I'm really interested in the problem gamblers. Just in terms of the electronic machines, who basically polices that and polices the venues, and how rigorously do they do that?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
How rigorously are the venues policed, so to speak? Who does that, and how rigorously is it done?
So the DIA changed the rules around host responsibility policies in 2023. So there's a bunch of harm minimisation things that the pokie venues are supposed to be doing. But what we understand is that the perceptions of compliance varies depending on who you ask. In the problem gambling sector, my understanding is they think that not enough is done to intervene when people are exhibiting signs of problem gambling behaviour. But again, this is a DIA issue.
So we don't police it; it's policed by DIA. Do we have any sense of their resources down here to?
So we have alcohol licensing inspectors who will go to pubs that have pokie machines in them, and if they have reason to suspect that there is a venue that's not acting outside their license, they would contact DIA, but that is their only role, is just to kind of notify. They don't have any regulatory or inspection role beyond the actual alcohol license.
And do you have an idea of how many of those people are, how many licenses?
No, we don't.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Celeste, please.
I'm interested in the sort of geographic concentration of the sort of gambling machines. Are you able to just talk about what changes you've seen? Because my understanding is for harmful gambling, it's the proximity to gambling machines that's one of the issues. So having them located in communities, especially high deprivation areas where, so it's actually not just the number, it's the level of harm, and that itself is stained about the same. So you able to just expand a bit on that?
So yeah, venues are more heavily located and particularly in those sort of eastern suburbs. One of the issues that we do have with our policy is that most of our, or just in with gambling and more generally in Christchurch, is most of our venues were licensed before 2001. So they have 18 machines versus having 9 machines. So our number of machines per venue is also higher, in addition to having venues more heavily located in high deprivation communities. But that is just the nature of the Gambling Act, and our policy settings don't allow us to address that.
At a future date, depending on what the council decides to do, it actually would, it's not just the number of poker machines, but it's actually the concentration of them in proximity to communities that disproportionately are harmed by those activities. That would be an issue, which I think is important for us to look at.
Okay, thank you. Tyrone? You had 3.
I just want to unpick this density thing a little bit more, if possible. So yes, I understand that we've got the highest number of machines per capita, but do we have the highest number of venues per capita? That's not quite the same thing, right?
I don't know. I haven't done that calculation.
Right, because in my experience, I spend a lot of time at the Littleton Club. I'm not a gambler myself, but there are a lot of people there who are. But what I observe is that there are like however many machines in there, but like most of the time, you know, there's only like 2 or 3 people. You know, they're not all. So I don't know if there's a direct relationship between adding more machines and more people gambling. Is that a conclusion that's been drawn at all?
Research seems to indicate that there is a density issue with poker machines, and that the more available they are, then the more likely it is that someone has gambled within.
Right.
Sorry.
But availability could be more venues.
But it could be, it could just be the venue itself that is also contributing to that harm. But a lot of research does talk about it in terms of machines, not in terms of venues. So some venues only have 9 machines versus having 18, and that's sort of limits that are set by the Act. And that's why council can have a policy that limits the number of machines a venue can have, if that is something that council wanted to do.
So if we had 100 venues with 1 machine versus 5 venues with 20 machines, which one's going to have the worst outcome?
So probably the venues, because it's the accessibility, with proximity to other people.
Right. So okay, no, that's cool. And just and just in terms of the problem gambling thing, so we've got a higher percentage in Christchurch, so has the research drawn a direct relationship between numbers of machines and problem gambling? Because I noticed in the assessment it also said it's all self-reporting. So perhaps we're just better at like being more open about like reporting ourselves, or maybe we've got more services. It could be any of those things, right? So there's not a direct relationship between those two things.
There doesn't seem to be a direct relationship between number of machines and expenditure, but research indicates within the literature that there is a relationship between number of machines and harm.
Number of machines or number of
machines.
venues? Right,
yes.
Machines, okay. And just another one final question, just about TABs. Sorry, I sort of just don't quite understand
So if there was a new TAB, just that whole 200-metre rule within an ECE, for example, right? That's not an existing
No,
rule,
in
though,
the
is it?
current policy, it's just within district plan requirements.
Yeah.
So wherever I think it's just the commercially zoned area, a TAB venue can establish.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we've got two questions left, and I'll just throw 5 cents in here. I think we're getting the impression that we should, as long as we've got an option in there, to status quo, and also maybe writing a letter to DIA about jackpot caps. We are running well over time, but we've got 2 more questions, one from Mel and then one from Yanni, and then we'll call it a day. Thank you.
I was just wondering that graph about the expenditure from gaming machines, is that there's no data prior to 2015?
On deprivation.
The expenditure.
Oh, yes.
Which is
so we do have it, but it's not using the March quarter. So it's a different set of data.
This would be interesting because there was quite a big change from 2004 in terms of the decrease in machines.
Yes, so we do have that information and we can include that in the report to council. We have it going back to 2004.
Right.
Yes.
Yep. The other question I had, just with all the wording changes, tidy up definitions and stuff you said, can that stuff be changed without going?
No.
So we have to go through a special consultation. Yeah. I think having a tidy up rule is good, but anyway, yeah.
Okay, and thank you. And lastly, Yanni, please.
Yeah, thank you for the awesome work that you've done on this. Lots of information. I was quite interested to understand with the gaming venue expenditure by deprivation, if we could get some information on what the trends have been over time as well. So like we've only got the snapshot of 2024, but actually seeing what's happened over time, I think would be quite useful. The other question I had was around, do we have an idea of the expenditure by venue and what the trends are? So we've heard a lot about geographic areas, socioeconomic areas of, deprivation.
So we do have this data by venue, but only for 2023. I'm not sure when DAA started collecting this data, but we could ask and present that more generally when we report back to council. But the key thing here is that we can't actually talk about any specific venue.
Right. Could you talk by ward or by, what's the lowest measurement of area that you could get data for that wouldn't?
We only have this by deprivation. We don't have it by ward, although I suppose we could map it ourselves. It would just take a while.
Time. Yeah, I guess I was really interested in seeing what the trends were rather than just a snapshot for a current year, because otherwise it's hard. You've done that for the other data, which is really good. And then the other question I had was in terms of the money going back into the community, again, do you have that by deprivation or by geographic area?
We have it by community group. So it will be the information is provided based on what address they provide to the corporate society when they make the application. So we could work that out, but again, it would.
Do we see, but what in terms of the trends? Do we see any trends in terms of Christchurch around where the redistribution of the expenditure goes?
So we do see the same groups are frequently receiving the big grant funding, so particularly like rugby groups and level groups. But also those bigger groups tend to be more regional groups as opposed to specific to a ward or a neighbourhood.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, that's good. No, you're yawning. You're yawning. You're stretching, I shouldn't say. Thank you very much. My personal view is I'd like to see us start doing the same thing on vape shops, because I know not my favourite thing. But thank you for all you've put in. And that concludes our workshops for today. Thank you very much.